When Emily called, her voice carried the weight of something unspoken. "Ryan, I need a favor." She explained that Mark needed a place to stay for a while. She didn't go into too much detail, just that things had been rough between them, and he needed space. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to help, but because Mark had always been complicated for me. He was the kind of man who commanded a room effortlessly, his confidence effortless and steady. Even when I first met him years ago, something about him unsettled me in a way I never voiced. He was my sister's husband. That was the only thing that mattered. When he arrived, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a tired expression, I could tell he wasn't here just for space. Something deeper was wrong. He gave me a small nod, that familiar gruffness in his voice. "Appreciate it, man." "No problem," I said, stepping aside to let him in. Mark took up space, even in my small apartment. He wasn't loud or overbearing, but his presence filled the rooms in a way I wasn't used to. The first few days were mostly quiet. He didn't talk much, didn't mention Emily beyond a vague. "She's figuring some things out." I didn't push. It wasn't my place. At night, I'd hear him moving around in the guest room, restless. A couple of times, I caught him staring out the window, lost in thought, a beer dangling from his fingertips. I wanted to ask what was really going on, but instead, I kept my distance, treating him like any other guest. Then came the little moments. First time, it was nothing, just a brush of hands when we both reached for the same coffee mug. His fingers, rougher than I expected, lingered for half a second too long. We laughed it off, but something tightened in my chest. Then, one night, we were watching some mindless action movie, something we weren't really paying attention to. Mark made some offhand comment about the ridiculousness of the fight scenes, and I shot back with a sarcastic remark. He grinned, nudging me with his knee. It was playful, casual, but for some reason, my skin burned where he touched me. I told myself I was imagining it. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, trying to ignore the way my pulse had jumped. He was my brother-in-law. He was straight, was staying here because his marriage was falling apart, but something in the air had shifted, and I wasn't sure I could ignore it much longer. The first real conversation happened over beers. Mark had been pacing the apartment all evening, restless, like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. I didn't ask questions. I figured he'd talked when he was ready. It was past midnight when he finally sank onto the couch beside me, rubbing a hand over his face. "You got another one of those?" he asked, nodding toward my beer. I grabbed him one from the fridge, and for a while we just sat there, drinking in silence. The only sound, the low hum of the TV. Then out of nowhere, he sighed. "I don't know what the hell I'm doing anymore." I glanced at him. "You want to talk about it?" he let out, a dry laugh. "Not really, but I guess I should." He took another swig, staring at the floor. "Emily and we've been off for a long time. I don't even know if we love each other anymore, or if we're just holding on because it's easier than letting go." I didn't know what to say. He wasn't just talking about a rough patch. He was talking about an ending. "That's heavy," I said finally. Mark shrugged. "Yeah, it is." He turned to me, his eyes a little glassy from the alcohol. "You ever been in love, Ryan?" The question caught me off guard. "Not really." He smirked. "Bullshit." I laughed, shaking my head. "I've dated, but nothing serious." Mark studied me for a second, then took another sip of his beer. "You ever feel like maybe you've been looking in the wrong places?" My breath hitched. It was an innocent question on the surface, but the way he said it, the way his eyes lingered on me just a second too long, sent something electric through my chest. I swallowed hard, trying to play it cool. "I don't know, maybe." We fell into silence again, but it wasn't awkward. If anything, it felt loaded. Like something unspoken hung between us, waiting to be acknowledged. Over the next few days, the tension only grew. Mark started noticing things, complimenting me in ways that didn't feel entirely casual. "You been working out?" he asked one morning as I walked into the kitchen shirtless. "You're looking solid." I shrugged a little. His eyes flickered over me. Before he looked away, it shows. It was stupid. A meaningless comment. But it stuck with me all day. Then there were the touches light, fleeting, but enough to make my pulse jump. A hand on my shoulder that lingered too long. A knee brushing against mine when we sat too close on the couch. Once, when I passed him a beer, his fingers grazed mine, and he didn't pull away immediately. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it. I was reading too much into things because I wanted to. Then Ethan, my best friend, decided to make it worse. We were at our usual bar, me venting about the weird energy in my apartment. Ethan smirked. "Dude, are you sure he's as straight as you think?" I scoffed. "He's married to my sister." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And marriages end. People change. Maybe he's realizing some things." I rolled my eyes. "You're reaching." He took a sip of his beer. I'm just saying, pay attention. "You might not be the only one feeling something." I told him he was ridiculous, but later that night when Mark and I sat together, the space between us feeling smaller than ever, I wondered if Ethan had a point. Mark was making himself at home. At first, it was little things: leaving his shoes by the door, taking over half the fridge with his protein shakes and meal prep. But then he got too comfortable. Like when he started walking around shirred. It shouldn't have been a big deal. It was just a guy in his own space. Right. But I wasn't blind. Mark was built like someone who actually stuck to their gym routine. Broad shoulders, sculpted chest, toned abs. And he didn't seem to care that I noticed. I'd walk into the kitchen in the morning, bleary-eyed and barely awake, and there he'd be, leaning against the counter, coffee in hand, wearing nothing but sweatpants hanging low on his hips. "Mornin'," he'd say, smirking when he caught me looking. It was infuriating and distracting. I tried not to let it get to me. But between the late-night talks, the little touches, the way his eyes lingered a second too long, it was getting impossible to ignore the tension. Then came movie night. It had started as a normal evening. Couple of beers, some action flick. We'd both seen 100 times. Mark stretched out on the couch, taking up too much space, forcing me to sit closer than I probably should have. Halfway through the movie, I made some dumb comment about his favorite character getting his ass kicked. Mark scoffed. "You think you could take me?" I smirked easily. His eyebrow shot up. "Oh yeah." The next thing I knew, he launched at me, knocking the beer out of my hand as he tackled me onto the couch. I fought back, laughing as I tried to shove him off, but he was stronger, pinning me down with embarrassing ease. His knee pressed against my hip, one of his hands gripping my wrist above my head. I froze. So did he for a second. Neither of us moved. His breathing was heavy, his face inches from mine. I could feel the warmth of his skin, the weight of him against me. Then something shifted in his expression. The playfulness faded, replaced by something else. Something that made my stomach tighten. I swallowed hard, forcing out a laugh. All right, you win." Mark hesitated. Then, just as quickly as it happened, he let go, rolling off me with a grin. "Told you." Sat up, grabbing my beer to hide the way my hands were shaking. It was nothing, just a stupid wrestling match. Except it wasn't, not with the way he looked at me afterward. Not with the way my chest still felt tight from the weight of him. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that I wanted him, or the fact that I knew I shouldn't. Because no matter how much tension was building between us, Mark was still married too. My sister, Mark, stumbled in a little past midnight, his footsteps unsteady but controlled. He wasn't wasted, just loose enough that his usual walls were thinner. I was already on the couch, half asleep, but I sat up when I heard the door click shut. "Rough night?" I asked. Stretching, Mark let out a dry laugh, kicking off his shoes. "You could say that." He ran a hand through his hair, his shirt slightly unbuttoned, revealing a glimpse of his collarbone. He looked tired, worn down in a way I hadn't seen before. I grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and tossed it to him. He caught it with ease, cracking it open and taking a long sip before leaning against the counter. "Emily and I, we barely even talk." "Any more?" he said suddenly. His voice was low, almost like he wasn't sure he wanted me to hear. I wasn't sure how to respond. "I'm sorry," I said, because it felt like the right thing. Mark scoffed. "Are you?" I frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shook his head, pushing off the counter and pacing the small space. "It's just, I don't know, man. I feel like I've spent my whole life doing what I was supposed to do, being the guy people expected. And now I'm sitting here wondering if any of it was even real.
Damn.
His words hung in the air. Between us, I hesitated before speaking. Mark, he let out a breath, shaking his head. Forget it, I'm drunk. Ignore me. But I couldn't. Not when he looked at me like that. His eyes clouded with something deeper than alcohol. I stood up and crossed the room, placing a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to pretend with me. That's when everything changed. Mark tensed under my touch, but didn't pull away. Dead. He turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting mine. There was something raw in them, hesitation, fear, but also curiosity. My heart pounded. I should have moved. Back, laughed it off. Pretended this moment wasn't happening. But I didn't. Neither did he. The space between us disappeared in a slow, unspoken decision. At first, it was just the barest brush of lips. Question, not an answer. A hesitation, not a demand. Then Mark made a sound deep in his throat, somewhere between frustration and surrender, and the hesitation shattered. His hand gripped my waist, pulling me closer as our mouths pressed together in something deeper, something real. His breath was warm against my skin, his fingers digging into my back like he wasn't sure if he wanted to hold on or let go. I melted into him. The years of wondering, of wanting, crashing into me all at once. Then, just as quickly, he yanked himself back. His breathing was heavy, his eyes wide with something like panic. Shit, he muttered, running a hand over his face. Shit. Mark, he swallowed hard, shaking his head. I can't. And before I could say anything else, he turned and disappeared into his room, the door shutting between us with a quiet finality. I stood there, my lips still tingling, my heart still racing. He couldn't, but for those few stolen moments, he had. The next morning, the apartment felt different. Mark wasn't in the kitchen like usual, making his coffee with that groggy, half-awake expression. He wasn't in the living room, flipping through channels absent-mindedly. The only sign that he was still here was the faint sound of movement from his room, the rustling of clothes, the dull thud of a bag being zipped. I stood outside his door, hesitating. My fingers hovered over the handle before I forced myself to knock. Silence then, after a long pause, his voice. Yeah. I pushed the door open. Mark was facing away from me, shoving clothes into his duffel bag. His shoulders were tense, his movements rushed, like he just wanted to get out of here as fast as possible. You're leaving? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Yeah, just for a bit, he muttered. Need to clear my head.
I
Swallowed hard. Because of last night? Mark stiffened. He didn't answer right away, just kept packing. Finally, he exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. Look, Ryan, shouldn't have let that happen. That's not an answer. He turned around then, his expression unreadable. It was a mistake. My chest tightened. I knew I should have expected him to say that, but it still stung. Was it? I challenged, stepping forward. It sure as hell didn't feel like one. Mark clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He looked like he wanted to say something, to argue, but instead, he just shook his head. It doesn't matter, I scoffed. It matters to me. His gaze flickered just for a second, but then he hardened again. I have a wife, Ryan. Crossed my arms, and yet you kissed me. He flinched, like hearing it out loud made it real. Before either of us could say anything else, my phone buzzed. Emily's name flashed on the screen. I hesitated before answering. Hey, have you talked to Mark? She asked, her voice casual. He's been acting weird lately. I thought maybe he'd opened up to you. I glanced at Mark. He was staring at the floor, his jaw tight. Yeah, he's been stressed, I said, choosing my words carefully. He's thinking about heading out for a bit, just to clear his head. Emily sighed. Figures he's been so distant with me. I keep asking him what's wrong, but he just says he's figuring things out. I don't even know what. That means neither did I. I'm sure he just needs time, I said, my throat dry. Well, if you talk to him, tell him I love him, okay? She said with a soft laugh. and that running away from his problems won't fix them. I forced a smile, even though she couldn't see it. Yeah, I'll tell him. When I hung up, the room was unbearably quiet. Mark let out a bitter laugh. She has no idea. No, I admitted. She doesn't. He scrubbed a hand over. His face, I need to go. I took a step closer. Mark, you don't have to run. He looked at me, then really looked at me. And for a split second, I saw it, everything he wasn't saying. It's the fear, the want, the war raging inside him. But then he picked up his bag and walked past me. I let him go. For now, I caught up to him just as he reached the door. You're just going to leave? My voice was sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. Just pretend none of this ever happened. Mark sighed, his hand tightening around the strap of his duffel bag. Ryan, no, I cut him off. I need you to say it. I need you to look me in the eye and tell me last night meant nothing. He turned, finally facing me. His expression was guarded, his jaw clenched, but there was something else beneath it, something raw, something that made my chest ache. Ryan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I don't know what. You want me to say I stepped closer? I want the truth. Mark swallowed hard. His fingers flexed at his sides like he was trying to hold something in. The truth is, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I stayed silent, waiting. He let out a bitter laugh. I spent my whole life convinced I was one thing. I got married, built a life, did everything I was supposed to. And now, he shook his head. Now I don't know if any of it was real. His voice cracked on the last word, and something inside me twisted. Mark, I said quietly, have you ever been happy? He hesitated. That pause told me everything. He let out a shaky breath. I thought I was. I wanted to be. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Being with Emily always felt safe, expected. And with you, it's he stopped himself. My heart pounded. It's what he took a step closer. It's terrifying. I didn't move. Because it feels real. His voice was barely above a whisper. That. And I don't know what to do with that. The air between us was thick, charged with something neither of us could ignore anymore. I swallowed hard. Do you regret kissing? Me. Silence. For a second, I thought he wouldn't answer. But then so soft I almost didn't hear it, he whispered no. My breath caught. His hands clenched like he was trying to keep himself from reaching for me. But I don't know how to be this, Ryan. I don't even know where to start. I stepped even closer until I could feel his warmth. Then don't. Start alone. Mark's gaze searched mine, full of hesitation, of fear. But beneath it, there was something else. Something that felt a lot like hope. Mark sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped together, staring at the floor like it held the answers he was searching for. The weight of everything hung between. You as what had happened, what it meant, and where we could possibly go from here. I have to tell Emily, he finally said, his voice rough but certain. I nodded, even though the thought made my stomach twist. She deserves the truth. He let out a slow breath, rubbing his hands over his face. I don't know what's going to happen after that. I don't know what I'm doing, Ryan. I stepped closer, my heart hammering. You don't have to know everything right now. His eyes lifted to mine, searching, unsure. And what about us? I exhaled, offering a small, sad smile. I think that's something we figure out one step at a time. Mark stood, his movements hesitant, like he was still afraid of taking up space in this new reality. Before he could turn away, I reached for his hand, giving it a squeeze. He didn't pull away. I don't know where this is going, he admitted. But I don't want it to end here. A lump formed in my throat, but I managed to nod. Then it won't. He lingered for a moment, his thumb brushing over my fingers, before finally letting go. As I watched him walk out the door, I realized that sometimes love wasn't about having all the answers. Sometimes it was just about taking the first step and seeing where the road led.